Hello, welcome everyone. Warm greetings from Southern California. My name is Sherry Mueller, and it's my privilege to serve as the president of the Public Diplomacy Council. It's also my privilege to welcome each of you to this webinar, this First Monday Forum. The First Monday Forum is co-sponsored by the Public Diplomacy Council, the Public Diplomacy Association of America, and the USC Annenberg Center for Communication, Leadership, and Policy. I'd like to thank our tech host, rising professional Alistair Somerville, who works at Georgetown University in real life, for serving as our tech host today. He reminds me to ask you to use the chat box if you have some technical difficulties, and to use the Q&A box to raise your questions and write your questions out. That gives us the order in which they're put forward and is a great help. I also want to say a special thank you to our featured speaker today, John Maxwell Hamilton. Jack, my students read your book, just want you to know that. And one time when I used to work at the Institute of International Education, I had the pleasure of working with Jack and actually sent him to Kazakhstan. And as he said earlier today, brought him back. And that was a memorable project and one where we were so grateful to have his participation. And I have a feeling that everyone on this webinar today will feel exactly the same way, Jack. I'm going to turn the program now over to Joan Maurer, who is, along with Ambassador Greta Morris, co-chair of a joint program committee and has a dynamic career in public diplomacy in real life as well. She will do the official introduction of our featured speaker and award-winning author, and also moderate this session. Joan, over to you.
Thank you, Sherry, and welcome to Jack Hamilton, who is really a fantastic guy. I've also known him for a long time. He's a longtime journalist. He's been a professor at LSU for about 29 years. Jack has also served as the provost, so he's been in the middle of the diplomatic world of the universities, and he is a fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center. I'm going to make my introduction brief because I want to give Jack some time to really talk about the origins of propaganda in his fascinating book, and go into some of the personalities that made up the whole field in the very beginning. They themselves are intriguing people, and so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jack Hamilton.
Thank you very much, Joan and Sherry. You know, it's nice to have gone to give a talk where I go back with two people so long, many years ago, working with both of you, and I appreciate that experience. And I'm also glad that Nick's on this call because there's nobody better equipped to, I think, critique my book than Nick, given his incredible experience and deep knowledge about public diplomacy. I'm going to talk about public diplomacy because that's actually one of the more positive aspects of this book I've written, Manipulating the Masses, Woodrow Wilson and the Birth of American Propaganda. Much of the story is less positive, and of course I'll have to pay attention to that, but I do want to spend some time on more than I normally would on public diplomacy. Let me start out by just giving a quick overview of the book. So the Committee on Public Information was created 1 week after the United States declared war in April 1917. In fact, the committee was created even before we had a conscription law, or indeed had really started mobilization the way it needed to be done in order for us to fully participate in the war. The person who was put in charge of the Committee on Public Information was a man named George Creel, who was a singularly bad but very colorful choice for the job. He was bad because he often lost control of his emotions, as it were, and said and did things that put the CPI, as it was called, in a bad light. The CPI was our first and only ministry of propaganda. But as I argue in the book, virtually everything the CPI did is done today, even down to the level of social media, and I'll come to that in a minute. It's hard to imagine, actually, when you think about it, how, and I certainly didn't fully understand when I started out, the extent to which the CPI actually became engaged in trying to shape what people thought. George Creel once said that we used every means of communication possible, and that's true. He also said, by the way, that they never used deception, never appealed to emotion, and never did anything that they couldn't be proud of, and that wasn't true. And I'll say a little bit about that. So basically, the CPI shot propaganda through every capillary in the American blood system, as it were. They were a publishing conglomerate. They had pamphlets, news services, both in the United States and overseas. They published a daily newspaper called the Official Bulletin. They syndicated stories and cartoons. Those were separate bureaus that did that went to newspapers around the country, often by the best, not only the best cartoonists, but some of the very best journalists and writers. They had thousands of press releases. In fact, they made press releases a quotidian aspect of American governing. Before the war, there were press releases. Theodore Roosevelt used them rather effectively, but he used them episodically. Under the CPI, they just came out in a gusher-like fashion, and really initiated the idea of prepackaged news being a part of what the White House needed to do on a daily basis. They had a division of pictorial publicity, which produced 1,500 poster designs, cards, advertisements, seals, buttons. They did this for 98 agencies and committees. The committees, that is, ranged from the Federation of Neighborhood Associations to the Salvation Army. They distributed thousands and thousands, tens of thousands really, of slides, lantern slides that were created by the military that could be used in lectures. They piggybacked on the motion picture industry. They used advertising associations and leading advertising executives. They worked with universities to an extent that today I think would be seen as appalling, because they managed actually to turn university professors into propagandists. They worked with other professional bodies. They also worked with the Boy Scouts, traveling salesmen, corporate titans, anyone they could enlist in the cause, they enlisted. Advertisements were ubiquitous in newspapers, CPI advertisements. Families watched CPI films in movie theaters. There was a wonderful little quote I found on a postcard. It's from a guy named William Johns. Johns was the head of the advertising division. Like many of the people who worked for the CPI, he worked for free. And his job was to mobilize advertising executives around the country to help produce propaganda. He was taking a trip out in Colorado, and he wrote this postcard, and he said that he marveled at the ubiquity of the CPI's famous Red Cross poster. This was a poster that had a Virgin Mary-like nurse on it. And the poster, he said, was in the windows of towns on the prairies, towns hardly as big as this postcard, out in the flat, arid lands. The reason I like that quote is it tells you how extensive the CPI's work was. You could decide not to go to a movie theater, and you could decide not to read a newspaper, but you couldn't miss CPI messages. They were everywhere, whether you wanted to see them or not. And I think that's an important aspect of what the CPI did. It was non-consensual. It was using the taxpayers' dollars to get them to think something that the Woodrow Wilson administration wanted them to think. The anti-democratic side of this were such things as censorship, the use of coercion to get people to do what you wanted them to do, tendentiousness, the idea of trying to shape American views by giving them only some of the facts that you wanted them to have, the use of fear and emotion, also front organizations, particularly with labor and immigrant groups that appeared to be grassroots organizations, but were really run and directed by the CPI, and disinformation. They paid people overseas, journalists overseas, to write stories they wanted written. In Sweden, as a matter of fact, they actually created a newspaper of their own with the Allies, in cooperation with the Allies, to shape the views of people in Switzerland, because that neutral country, they wanted to support the United States and the Allies rather than the Germans, which many Swedes were inclined to do. To give you an idea of how tendentious and how over the top they could sometimes be, I want to just show you this cover again. It's a picture of the Statue of Liberty being attacked by German planes. In fact, the Statue of Liberty's head is on the ground smoldering with New York City in the background. I like this poster for two reasons. First of all, it tells us something important about the CPI, or about its approach. It was produced by a famous artist named Joseph Pennell, who was an Englishman who came to the United States. And he was, for many people, look at this poster and say, well, it's not really a CPI poster, and you can't blame the CPI for everything that was over the top. And of course you can't. But this particular poster was, in fact, created by the CPI. And I learned this by digging through some files where Pennell says that he came up with the idea for the poster at a meeting of artists put on by the CPI who wanted a poster to sell Liberty bonds. And also the CPI helped him produce it. Nowhere on it does the CPI say that, does it say the CPI was behind it, but it was. And I think that shows you how pervasive the CPI was, how it worked in so many different ways. The poster is also important because it carries with it an important message that the CPI tried to advance. The problem for the Wilson administration and the CPI was that the war was nowhere close to the United States. It was an ocean away, and it posed no particular threat to the United States. The war posed no threat. The Germans posed no threat. So as a result of that, the CPI had to find a way to make the war seem more urgent and immediate. And one of the ways they did that was they tried to suggest that Germans were ubiquitous in the United States, trying to shape our views and undermine our war effort, and that they were capable at any moment of blowing up an ammunition plant or in some other way subverting the American economy or American democracy. In fact, before the war, the Germans had done a few things, before we got into the war, had done a few things in the United States, some of them rather dramatic. But during the war, only one spy was ever actually apprehended and tried and convicted. Newspapers, however, had every day stories about supposed spies, would-be spies who were lurking in every city and hamlet in the country. The CPI capitalized on this by calling information that they found inconvenient spy talk. If you were saying something that challenged the administration's point of view, you were saying what the enemy wanted you to say, and somehow the enemy had gotten you to say it. This is a very interesting parallel here for today, because the words that President Trump used was fake news. If you wanted to fence back some information that he found inconvenient, he called it fake news. So that, as I say, gives you an example of the emotion that the CPI used. I want to also read for you one particular quote that will give you an idea, and also has to do with the CPI Liberty loans advertisements. And this was an advertisement for students. It's a very significant advertisement because actually German education had been more important to American universities than even British education. Many of our leading scholars went to Germany to be trained in epistemological research. And we before the war, greatly respected the Germans. But then when the war came, we had to find a way to not respect them. And so this is an ad that was used in student newspapers to promote Liberty loans, to get students to buy them. And it goes like this. In the vicious guttural language of Kultur, the degree AB means Bachelor of Atrocities. Are you going to let the Prussian python strike at your alma mater? It went on, by the way, into a frenzy of mixed metaphors. The Hohenzollern Fang strikes at every element of decency and culture and taste that our colleges stand for. It leads a track so terrible that only whispered fragments can be recounted. It has ripped all the old world romance out of war and reduced it to the dead black depths of muck and hate and bitterness. This is a remarkable turnaround given the importance that Germans had for our education system, and now we're being deified. So I'll leave the CPI at that for the moment. And I want to go on to the idea of public diplomacy. Incidentally, the first use of the term public diplomacy that I could find comes up in a newspaper, the Berliner Tageblatt, which in 1917 talked about new diplomacy, and in this case talking about how the Germans were so enlightened in their willingness to settle for peace with the Russians, the Bolsheviks, and that peace negotiations began in 1917. And they extolled the fact that the Germans were so benign in the way they were willing to treat the rest of the world and were going to show mercy to the Russians, which of course they didn't do. CPI didn't use the term public diplomacy, of course, that comes 50 years later, but they really embedded the idea of public diplomacy. And we can find the roots of it in so many things that we look at today that constitute public diplomacy. Libraries in abroad, speakers trips where we send people overseas to speak, trips to bring journalists to the United States to learn about the United States. Those things all existed under the CPI. In addition to that, the CPI started a news service that for the first time allowed the United States to get American news overseas, that is American news written by Americans. In the past, those pathways abroad were controlled by wire services in other countries and through a complicated arrangement that I can go into if you like. And they also sent commissioners abroad. Now, here's where we see some of the great heroes, and it's where we see some of the problems. I'm going to deal with the problems first because I think they're significant and haven't really been recounted in the past to the extent I think they should have been. George Creel was, as I say, hyperbolic. Under his stewardship at the CPI, a new word was invented for the twisting of information by the administration, and it was called creeling. Today, of course, we use the word spinning. Creel could be in 20 different places at once, it seemed. He would reorganize the CPI to such a great extent that on one day you wouldn't know, people in the organization wouldn't know what was going to come the next day. At the end of the war, when they tried to figure out how many actual commissioners there had been overseas, they couldn't even get a proper tally of them because the records were so poorly kept. Creel didn't answer correspondence. He would send people abroad without a clear mission, and he also violated a central tenet he had when he started this effort overseas, which was that the people he was sending abroad were supposed to be very knowledgeable about the countries that they went to, that they were supposed to be experts in those countries so that they could operate effectively. And of course, that didn't really happen consistently. It happened in a few cases. And I'm going to go through and show that in a second, but I want to make one other point. And that was that he also experienced a huge amount of resistance from the State Department and the embassies and legations, which didn't want anything to do with public diplomacy. They thought that diplomacy was, as one diplomat put it, a pretty good club. They didn't even think consular officers were worth much. They only thought that regular foreign service officers were. And the idea of sending Americans abroad to deal with the hoi polloi, the people on the street, was anathema to the traditional diplomat. And that made it difficult in many cases for the CPI's commissioners to do their job. Carl Crow was one of these, a fascinating character who had been in China many years and had even interviewed Sun Yat-sen in his day. He introduced poker to China. He set up the first PR agency in China. That happened after the war. He wrote a very popular book called Handbook of China. When Crow arrived, nobody knew what to do with him. He was called by one official an American of doubtful status. Finally, Crow just printed up his own calling cards and gave himself the rank essentially of a third secretary and let it go at that. Another person sent abroad, another very interesting person sent abroad, was Charles Merriam. Merriam was the first member of the University of Chicago faculty hired under the designation political science. And he founded the behavioral movement in political science, which today is very important to the way elections are manipulated and how we decide how we can sway voters. He was really the founder of that. He wasn't himself a quantitative researcher, which is used very much in behavioralist work, but he was very skilled at the ideas and trained the next generation of scholars who ended up doing this work. When he went to Italy to be the commissioner, he knew nothing of Italy. In fact, all he knew when he got there was what he read on the book. He was one case where he was welcomed by the ambassador named Page, but also he quickly took liberties and changed his title to plenipotentiary something or other. I can't remember the exact term. He took an Italian woman as a noble woman as a mistress, and he went around town saying that people shouldn't really talk to the ambassador, that he had more power and he could get information to President Wilson more readily than they could. He eventually had to be sent home, even though he had some extraordinary successes. The man Creel put in charge of Paris, which was supposed to be a headquarters, was a guy named James Kearney, who was the editor of the Trenton Times and an old friend of Wilson's. Kearney had absolutely no training for this job. He once commented that there's a great difference between Paris and Trenton, and you notice it more in Paris than you do in Trenton. He was widely criticized, and justifiably, by diplomats because of his ignorance. Creel reversed himself in the case of Carey when he heard this criticism and said, oh no, he didn't really want to send people abroad who were that sophisticated. He said, who would want to send people who only speak French, act French, and think as little like an American as possible, which of course is just the opposite of what he said he wanted to send in the first place. He also foisted people on Carey to put into jobs such as the American wife of a marquis and an American actress who was a friend of his wife, who was an actress. Okay, there are two great heroes of this story. One is a woman named Vera Whitehouse, who was known as one of the most beautiful women in New York, and also and very wealthy, and had almost single-handedly won the vote in 1917 for women to have suffrage. Creel picked her up to go to Bern, where she met enormous resistance, but showed equally tough resistance. Finally, she became so fed up with the foot dragging by the embassy that she went back to the United States on her own, went to see Woodrow Wilson, and made him give her two letters to give one to the ambassador, two to the ambassador, one of which said she was in charge of diplomacy, what we call public diplomacy, and also that she could operate openly and not secretly. Significantly, one of the young officers at the embassy was Allen Dulles, who had suggested to her that she should operate secretly, pose as a journalist, and not let it known that she was doing American publicity work, which she resisted. Just to flash forward a minute, you may recall that when Allen Dulles became the head of the CIA, he had a pattern of using journalists as spies and for propaganda and disinformation. Anyway, Whitehouse was quite a woman. Here's what one of the Foreign Service officers said about her after she came to Washington. She came with murder in her heart, as you said she had, and proceeded to raise the devil around here. She dominated George Creel and had things her own way. The State Department official goes on. He says, "You guys are going to have to cooperate. Every bit you're supposed to give every bit of cooperation as possible." And he added, "You should do the same over there. Incidentally, I hear that she rather has it in for you." This was directed at a diplomat named Hugh Gibson. When it was all over, Allen Dulles wrote this to Lansing. Lansing, by the way, was his uncle. Lansing was Secretary of State. And he said, "Mrs. Whitehouse, I am frank to admit, is doing good work, much better than I had thought possible. She is having real influence in placing American news in Swiss newspapers and is in touch with a great many influential Swiss. The influence of America in Switzerland is tremendous now." That's a great compliment to her. The other hero in this story is a guy named Arthur Bullard, someone who deserves a full biography and has never received it. He was an extraordinary journalist. He died rather young, which cut short his career. He had been overseas in a lot of different places, wrote about the Panama Canal, had covered the Russian Revolution in 1905, and had written an article and a book right before the war that suggested the need for a propaganda agency. But his idea of propaganda was somewhat different from the one that ended up existing because he was so high-minded. He worked initially in Washington for Creel and then went to Russia on his own as a journalist, but quickly fell into working with the embassy, doing some propaganda work. And then later, when the CPI finally sent someone to Russia to be the commissioner, the full commissioner, he set up a full-fledged office. One of the things he did that is extraordinary, and to me, actually really outstanding, is he wrote a series of letters for the Russians called Letters from an American Friend. And what makes them exemplary as public diplomacy is that they were so honest and balanced. Bullard had been a social worker and a socialist in New York early in his career. And so he was very attuned to the idea of revolutions and why they were important. He was also very sensitive. He was actually a very sensitive individual. And the letters come across as being equally sensitive. Here's one of the things he writes in one of his letters. We are keenly conscious of our shortcomings. We hope that you will learn the lessons of freedom more quickly than we have done. That's a wonderful, there's much more in these letters, but that's a wonderful way to approach, I think, another country, which is to be humble and to show some kind of common cause with them rather than preaching. He eventually had to leave Russia as a result of an event I'll touch on briefly in a minute. And when he did, George Kennan later said, the American had lost a very important individual to its work in Russia. George Kennan called Bullard the best American mind observing on the spot the course of the Russian Revolution, which is very high praise indeed. So as I say, Bullard was an extraordinary individual. The reason he had to leave prematurely is because of one of the worst screw-ups by the CPI in their entire short history. And that was an effort to send somebody named Edgar Sisson, who had no qualifications whatsoever to go abroad. He was a former muckraking journalist and editor, to head the CPI mission. And while he was there, he fell in with the idea that he had discovered documents. These were documents that were given him by white Russians that purported to show that the Bolsheviks were not really Russians at all, that they were German agents who were trying to sell out their country and would organize a peace to help the Germans. There's a whole lot to go into this. I'll leave it just to say that when Sisson felt that the stories were going to be so over the top, that and so important, that he had to pull out Bullard because he was afraid that Bullard and his colleagues could be injured by the Bolsheviks when this news came out. Anyway, I'll leave it at that. So there's some more takeaways here about what we can think about with propaganda today and how we might deal with it, but I'll leave it at that for the moment.
Jack, thank you very much. That was great, tour de force, and also very amusing. I think we've learned that, plus ça change, as they say. Resistance to public diplomacy by State Department, sending unqualified people overseas. It seems like Groundhog Day. I actually am going to go straight to questions because the first question that I had prepared is actually been asked by Mike Anderson. And I just want to encourage everybody to go to the Q&A box, type your questions. I'm monitoring the box and I'll start going through them. But I'm going to start with Mike Anderson's question, which was my question basically. And he asks, what do you think has been the long-lasting damage to press freedom by the Trump administration's use of the word fake news? And what are your remedies for improving our image abroad, particularly in terms of our news gathering functions?
Well, I think, well, first of all, as a matter of historical interest, possibly, the term fake news wasn't coined by Donald Trump, although he claims that he coined it. In fact, that claim is itself fake news. The term was used even at the end of the 19th century to describe, and it was in a book title, to describe the terrible reporting done on the Spanish-American War and the war in Cuba, and the news that was just made up in many cases. The damage that's been done, a considerable amount of damage has been done, I think, by the Trump administration to all of our institutions, whether it's, the courts or the FBI. I mean, the list really goes on. It's a kind of paradox that if you want to run government, it has to be credible. And yet we had a president who tried to damage the credibility of the very institutions that he could use to affect change, positive change. So what do we do about this? Well, the CPI's, there's a lot to do about it, and I'm not going to suggest that I don't want to be a know-it-all on a subject as difficult as that one. But I will say this, one of the things about the CPI is that the troubles they had in dealing and trying to institute public diplomacy are very similar to the problems we have today. Where does it belong in the bureaucracy? Should it be in the embassy, outside the embassy? Should it be in the State Department, outside the State Department? Where should VOA be? All of these kinds of questions still exist. And so does the question, what should we do in propaganda? There were those who feel today that propaganda, for example, the VOA, should be a weapon of diplomacy in the sense that we should weaponize it, as it were, in order to get people to agree with our policies. And there are others who think the VOA ought to exist as an exemplar of an open democratic society in which you report information and news in a fair, as objective as possible way. Those questions still exist. Maybe I'm old-fashioned and maybe I'm naive, but my own view is that we have to try to reestablish ourselves as being a fair, decent country that respects other people and has a real respect for balanced information by behaving that way through the propaganda agencies we have. Propaganda is a pejorative term, but it can be a positive term depending on how it's used. We can also find in other words like public diplomacy, which should have a moral component to it, I think. That's where we go back to somebody like Arthur Bullard. I don't pretend, Mr. Anderson, to say I've got a really great answer, but I think that's a way to look at it.
Okay, great. We actually, Sherry, our moderator, who introduced you. She has a question, which I was also curious about. What was the budget of the CPI, and how much money was put behind this project? And if there's any way you could compare what the what public diplomacy is today, which I think is basically pretty modest. What part of the budget it made up in the Wilson years?
So the budget actually has a really good question, and it leads to some important points. So the CPI's budget, depending on how you calculate, was about $5 million, but that doesn't mean a lot by itself. It is a small amount. But let's back up and talk about where the budget came from. This has never really been said before, but I'm saying it. The CPI was arguably unconstitutional in the way it existed. Congress didn't approve it. Creel wasn't appointed with the consent of the Senate. It was created by an executive action, and the budget that would normally have congressional oversight didn't, because Wilson gave Creel money from a special wartime budget he was given that didn't require individual permission for individual expenditures. It was Wilson's war fund. As a result of that, it immediately set up a problem, which was that Congress, which didn't like the idea of a propaganda agency, period, by anybody, Republican or Democrat, now had to look at this alien institution reporting to Wilson and seemingly and correctly existing to promote Wilson and his policies. So that's the first thing to say about the budget. The second thing to say is that the CPI's budget was supplemented in a variety of ways. In some cases, people like Ernest Poole, who were very wealthy, put money in out of their own pocket. Many people worked for tiny amount of money. Those ad executives, large number of the executives, including all the ad staff, worked for, except for the secretary, worked for $1 a year. Newspapers were not allowed to be paid for publishing ads for, say, Liberty loans, believe it or not, which made the newspapers angry, because if you can pay people to build ships, why can't you pay people to publish the ads? But anyway, so there were millions and millions of dollars of free advertisements. The artists who wrote posters or painted posters, drew posters, they did that for free, and the list goes on. So as a result, you could say, well, that was very cost effective, but that's another aspect that should worry us, because when you were getting all of this these free services, then the question is, it's even less accountable. And so on the one hand, you can admire Creel's creativity and energy, which he had lots of, but also worry about the lack of accountability. So anyway, the total amount of money and then they also sold films that they made. And so as a result of that, they had some income. So in the end, they actually put money back in. So it comes out to about $5 million, I guess. There was $7 million if you count, I think it's 7, if you count the receipts they had. But as I say, they returned money to the treasury. So it was a very small amount of money. It had a huge bang for the buck.
Well, great. So moving on, we've got a number of comments coming in furiously at this point. Mike Hurley is asking, we are in an era where the Russians and the Chinese are pushing back on us around the world. And his question is, what should we be doing about that? What are the limits of us basically trying to counter Russian and Chinese propaganda and propaganda from others who bad actors who don't like us?
Right. Well, you sort of alluded to this, Joan. I think public diplomacy is not as well funded as it could be. And part of that's understandable that it doesn't get the same amount of attention when you look at all the problems the United States faces right now, and you have to choose what you're going to prioritize. But I think you could argue, as many do, that in a world where soft power matters, we do need to put more money into public diplomacy, and we need to do it creatively. And as I said before, I think one of the ways to do it is to do public diplomacy that exemplifies the values that America has tried to stand for in the past. I think if it were a straight war between us doing propaganda openly and the Chinese and the Russians doing propaganda openly, I think that's a fight we have a pretty good chance of succeeding at. I mean, it's not a question of winning, right? It's a question of making inroads. Where I think our big problem is that the amount of information that is propagandistic, but anonymous, coming through bots and bot armies and coming over the internet in ways that you can't trace where it comes from, who does it, and is full of disinformation, is a huge challenge for us. And although it's rarely said, we do the same thing ourselves. We don't confess to doing it, but we engage in that warfare, and we can. And I'm not making the statement we shouldn't do it. I'm not making the statement we should. But we now live in a world where the lack of accountability for information makes it more pernicious, and the cause of that lack of anonymity, the way we can use technology, also means that bogus information can travel widely very quickly in a way that it couldn't before, when it had to come through establishment media and could be vetted. So how we deal with that is a question I don't know the answer to. I'll make one observation that I think is worth considering, but I don't know that it leads us to a utterly satisfactory conclusion. And here's what it would be. In the past, when people would publish disinformation or fake news, there was an element of accountability. I just thought of this, but I'll make myself as an example. So some years ago, I wrote an article for the New York Times in which I came up with a list for the 10 most stolen books. And I made up the entire list. I just made it up. And because, how the hell would I know what books were stolen? I did a lot of reporting, put them in categories. The Bible was the most stolen. Probably is, by the way. The Bible's probably the most stolen. This appeared in the New York Times, and I'd walk down the street the next week in Washington, where I was living at the time, and people say, "Jack, that was a great story. I didn't know The Little Red Pony was the 3rd most stolen book." And I say, it was made up. That was just made up. Well, today you really have to be careful about making things up, because you now realize we live in a world where anybody can make anything up. But when I did that, if there were a problem or somebody had a question, I was accountable. You could come to me and say, "Jack, why the hell do you think the Bible was the most stolen book?" And I could say it was a joke, or I could say, "Well, here's the evidence." But today we don't have any way of finding out, in many, many cases, who originates the propaganda. Our government can tell us that it's the Russians, but imagine our government telling us the Russians made something up and they didn't. Imagine our government telling us that the Russians made something up and we made it up. I mean, it becomes very chaotic, right? And we live in this kind of world, crazy world that spies often live in, where what's true and what's not true. One of the ways I think to get around that is to have some legislation for at least those portals of information that we we have some control over, Google, Facebook, places like that, that requires a level of accountability. So when a newspaper puts something out, they have to be accountable for it. But when Google puts something out, they're not accountable for it. And that lack of accountability is a problem. I recognize their whole model is based in part on addicting us beyond the site all the time, but in part on not having to spend a lot of money to vet information. But there may be ways to at least make some inroads on that. But apart from that, I think it's one of our looming national security problems, really.
Jack, I think you probably just volunteered to testify on the Hill, because those are these issues that are now coming to the fore. There's a lot of interest in that, including at the FTC, I understand. I've got some actually a related question from Brian Carlson, and he wanted to know if the CPI practice vilifying our adversaries instead of not just promoting ourselves, but actually attacking the bad guys. Was there that aspect to the CPI? Right.
First, let me just say that Brian may not remember this, but I interviewed him when I was doing research on the book. My approach to the book was to look everywhere I could to find out information, even contemporaneously, and I really appreciated having the chance to talk to him. I got a lot out of it. He's someplace in the footnotes too, I think. So, having said that, yes, they did. They claimed they didn't, but they did make the Germans were vilified. I just read you the quote, right? That awful quote that was written for the ad about buying Liberty bonds. The ad for the ad that was in school newspapers, and so I'll read you another one, by the way, by a guy who actually was an extraordinary journalist and really was the first journalist to do consumer affairs reporting. But when he got in charge of work for the CPI, he had a very anti-German point of view. And here's something he wrote in a novel that he wrote during the war about the Germans, about German Americans. He said, Deutschdom, that worldwide subterranean propaganda of German influence, German culture, German hopes and ambitions and future domination, which for a quarter of a century established itself reproductively as the Inkerman parasite that fixes its eggs to the body of a helpless host, which later their brood will prey upon and destroy. That's written by a CPI staff member. So posters depicted German soldiers as beasts, as apes. The bombing of our Statue of Liberty, the poster I showed you, all of those things show how they depicted the Germans, who had once been considered our most upright citizens, among our most upright citizens, now had become beasts and liars and baby killers.
Interesting. Yeah, my husband his family comes from Germany, and he's talked a lot about that. Greta Morris, who's my co-chair at the program committee, has a great question here, and she wants to know what happened to the CPI. When did it end, and what was its lasting influence on public diplomacy, for better or worse? Essentially, where did the CPI go?
Right. So the CPI, one of the sad, ironic parts of this book, as I've uncovered it, is that the CPI actually should have lasted longer. But it was in such bad odor by the press and by Congress and others that they could hardly wait to get rid of it. And so there was no way they could keep it going as a full-fledged institution after the armistice. And they began to shut it down. Parts of it, however, carried on for a while. There was an organization called the 4 Minute Men. These were people who stood up in movie theaters and spoke on messages the CPI gave them. They sent them around the country. They were all very well organized. They carried on for a little while. There was a group that dealt with immigrants that in many ways was quite progressive, and it existed under different iterations for several years. The official bulletin was put out of business by then a Republican-dominated Congress, which had been elected in November of 1918 and actually made it difficult for Wilson to get his peace policy through. So all the pieces continue to some of them continue to exist, but virtually all the activities continue to exist, but in different forms. The official bulletin comes back as the Federal Register, for example, and other publications we have today that are very positive in terms of a transparent democratic government. Also, there were a lot of press officers that had been with the CPI, and they just were all farmed out and went to work for the various agencies, because the way we run propaganda today, or publicity, is that it's a decentralized activity, not a centralized one. The public diplomacy didn't carry on after the war. It stopped. And the reason for that was that there wasn't that much support for it at the time. Same thing happened actually with psychological warfare. The CPI tried to have over the lines enemy propaganda, which was another part of the story, by the way, which has never been written about, and is a fascinating saga, where they tried to actually get the AAF to do. They were going to direct how the AAF did over the trenches propaganda. Eventually, they just, because of Creel's mismanagement, they gave up, and the AAF did it on its own, and were pretty successful in the last weeks of the war. And one of the people who was in charge of that was none other than Walter Lippmann, who incidentally wanted Creel's job, although he never admitted it later on. He was actually a very ardent propagandist at the time. So the CPI lives on in different iterations. Public diplomacy starts to come back in the 1930s in various ways. And I would defer to somebody like Nick Cull and others of you who know the history better than I do, the efforts to try to begin to deal with people, government to people propaganda, publicity. But the CPI's work peters out, even their international news services mothballed. It was unceremoniously dismantled. Its records were very poor. It took 2.5 years to finally reconstruct what the CPI had done and even figure out how they spent its money. It was such a mess. And as I say, the final report, they couldn't even tell how many commissioners there had been. Carl Crow claimed he never, ever got a letter to say he was out of business, and he kept working for months after the CPI went out of business until he finally had spent all the money, and then he quit. So there was a lot of chaos in the CPI when it was dismantled, but the pieces live on.
Great. Actually, one of our questioners was Deborah Trent. She actually taken her question down. It wasn't a question, but she pointed out that there has been a PDC, something written by John Brown about Creel and Walter Lippmann. So sounds like an interesting story in itself. Let me just turn, because you've talked a lot about the role of universities in the CPI and the role of professors and the whole nexus there. And Steve Goodman asked a question about what you think. Could you say a word about professors, public diplomacy, and public perceptions around the world? For instance, are you concerned about US universities establishing and expanding branch operations outside of the US? Is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? How does that help us? Should the government be supporting that? Kind of the whole role of universities in the public diplomacy world.
Right. So to be clear about this, I don't have any objection to universities being involved in public diplomacy in the way we have defined it as maintaining the old verities of honesty, scholarly rigor, balance, and all of those things that apply to journalists as well. And I believe very strongly in university exchange programs that go both ways. I think that's one of our great inventions. And incidentally, Arthur Bullard, whom I told you deserves to be credited as a hero, worked very hard to try to get the CPI to fund university exchanges. He saw as one of the best ways to have understanding between the Russians and the Americans was to have students go back and forth, which was very enlightened by Bullard. He failed to convince Creel. And anyway, the CPI didn't last long enough. You could have done it. It only lasted a year and a half. I don't have an objection. I don't see an objection to having universities go overseas to educate. or to have branches overseas. Obviously, a part of that's driven by economic considerations because the cohorts of students who are coming up are going to be smaller than they were in the past, and universities have to be creative. But one of the best things we have to export is our education system, and cutting off students so they can't come here, for example, is really cutting off our nose to spite our face, because that really serves us well. What the CPI did was it got university professors to write propaganda in which they said things that were not true and utterly unbalanced. And as a result of that, they put university, they put a scholarly imprimatur on information that was tendentious and inaccurate and emotion laden. And those are all very bad things for universities to do. And interestingly, just as an aside of how the CPI managed to suborn universities, they used the Columbia School of Journalism, for example. In fact, Lippmann's idea for a propaganda ministry was to use the journalism school at Columbia to be the propaganda ministry, and to have students write propaganda. And in fact, they already did this in early 1917. They suspended classes at the Columbia School of Journalism and told students that they could get their degree and all they had to do for the rest of the semester was write propaganda.
Wow.
In support of the war. Since I got Joan to say, wow, let me tell you another story about that. The second year the Pulitzer prizes were given out, a prize went to two students at Columbia who had written a monograph which praised newspapers in the United States for suppressing information that ran counter to the administration's point of view. I'll say that again: suppressing information that challenged the Wilson administration's point of view, and also for publishing information that supported the administration's point of view. In other words, they got a Pulitzer Prize for not doing what journalists are supposed to do. That's the kind of environment that existed in the country at the time among journalists as well as others.
Thanks, Jack. I'm going to combine our last two questioners on my list here, Mike Schneider and Mike Feldman. And they're kind of asking similar questions, which are, number one, what did other countries learn from us about the CPI? And also, what was the feeling of the American public about the CPI? So two kind of separate things, but sort of related in terms of public perception.
Okay, so first of all, the CPI, there's an iron law of propaganda, and the iron law of propaganda is that only the enemy does it. The CPI says we don't do propaganda. The Germans are the ones that do it. If you go through the files, as I've done for the Foreign Office during this time, the British Foreign Office, you see notes to each other where they say, wow, we don't even do propaganda. Those Germans are really doing terrible propaganda. It's a good thing we don't do anything like that. In point of fact, all the belligerent nations did propaganda. And to a certain extent, they all did the same thing. They suppressed information. They provided information that was one-sided. They used films. They used front organizations. All the things that the CPI did in the United States, many of the things the CPI did in the United States, were done by other countries, both attitudinally or the mindset, but also many of the instrumentalities of it. There were differences in this sense. They were organized differently. The German propaganda was organized with the military being more in charge, which had an adverse effect on how effective it was because it was too heavy-handed. We were better at using advertising. We came up with the idea of the 4-minute men, which some other countries Britain actually adopted that technique to a limited extent. And all of them went through reorganizations, constant reorganization. The British were reorganizing every couple of months. The Germans were constantly debating how it should be organized, who should be in charge, because this was a brand new activity. There had been propaganda before, of course, but this was the first time you had a total war where you had pervasive systematic propaganda. It never had happened before. And all of these countries were wrestling with ways to do it. The United States was different in one important way, and that sort of gets to the reputational quality that's asked by one of the questioners. in all the other countries, the people in charge were changed constantly and the organization was changed constantly. Wilson created the CPI and kept the CPI intact through the whole war. And he kept Creel in charge during the whole war, even though Creel was constantly under attack. He once came very close to having to fire Creel, and that was a couple of months before the war was over, when Creel had said something really stupid that so angered members of Congress that they decided to call him in for questioning and got control of the Wilson budget for the first time and controlled the domestic portion of the budget in the last couple of months of the war. But Creel was saved because Wilson was very loyal to him. He and Creel were very close, and Wilson had a quality of loyalty about him, so he kept Creel around. What was the reputation? People who knew Creel liked him. Many liked him, but even the people who knew him knew that he was too hyperbolic. He went too far. He said incendiary things. He was very heavy-handed dealing with the press when he saw them doing something he didn't like. And sometimes he would fabricate information, which of course, or embroider it, is probably the better way to put it. And all of those things caused a certain amount of resentment. On the other hand, journalists really depended on the handouts because they couldn't do the job of covering an enormous government without that help. And they used it, and they acknowledged they used CPI help. I think most people around the country didn't really spend a lot of time thinking about the CPI. We didn't have opinion polls at the time, but if you ask the average American, I don't think they paid much attention. What we can say is that the newspapers around the country ran CPI press releases, sometimes as written. Sometimes the most incendiary ones were published as written. I told you about those documents about Germans being agents, the Bolsheviks being agents of the Germans. Those were published in newspapers verbatim all over the United States, including the best paper. The biggest enemies for the CPI were sniping by journalists who didn't like the way Creel operated. That was number one, and Creel himself. Other organizations that were super patriotic organizations that would go even further than the CPI would in many cases, and wanted and sometimes thought the CPI didn't go far enough. And then people on the left, people with the masses and newspapers like that went after the CPI. And then finally members of Congress, particularly Republicans, who genuinely didn't like the CPI and didn't like Creel, but also raised some very important objections to the way it operated without any oversight.
Well, Jack, it's a fascinating book, and I hope I'll just make a plug for it. Hold it up so we can see it.
I feel like I should be one of those guys at the street corner getting you to go to the deli, and I hold up.
Buy it on Amazon. With that, I'm going to turn the program to close for some final remarks to Nick Cull. Nick has joined us. He's obviously a practitioner of public diplomacy, a professor at USC. He's going to be replacing Adam Powell, if that's possible, as our program person for PDC, and we welcome him. So Nick, over to you, and for some closing remarks on the program.
Well, thanks, Joan. I mean, the first thing I want to say is to just say thank you to John for writing the book, because you don't produce a book like this without really caring about the subject, without doing many hours of research in many places. And I know that you were in archives all over the world, and nobody will ever give you back what you put into it. But as a little small step in that direction, I just want to say thank you for taking the trouble to do it. And I think this goes beyond just being a book where somebody takes a position on a historical case to actually become a kind of public utility, because this book has been missing for a century. We allowed CPI to be covered by George Creel's own voice. His report and his memoir were the way in which that's how I footnoted CPI, and it's wonderful to have. It's like having this bridge that we can cross to access that material. And my hope is that this won't put other people off. They won't think, oh my God, Jack's written this book on CPI, we can't go there. I hope it can be an invitation to get new scholarship on CPI, particularly what I hope we will, and if anybody in the audience is looking for a project, the binational studies. So to look at what the CPI was doing in Spain or what the CPI was doing in Russia. There's an excellent book already on Italy, but to go for those micro studies, just don't bother with Brazil because the guy didn't ever show up, right? But and the other thing I wanted to say is that I appreciate how you've given these early days of public diplomacy a face, and you've narrated these bureaucratic tussles, but you've also shown that in other countries they had parallel problems. So much of what was happening at this time was structural, and it helps to understand that what's going on here is systemic, and maybe that helps us to understand our own situation, that it will always be difficult to bring together diplomacy, information, and public opinion, that those are kind of three elements that will rub up against each other, and to be braced, to not to think it's personal, but to expect these problems, and particularly don't insult the legislators. There's the moment when Creel says this dumb stuff in a speech about Congress. You're thinking, no, don't do it, and he does it with counterproductive consequences. So I've really enjoyed the book. It's something that I will go back to with students, that I will cite again and again. So thanks for doing it. With regard to the coming meetings, I know it's difficult to replace Adam, but I'm glad that the CCLP at USC will continue as a partner in these events, and I'm excited to see what we have coming up. On the 7th of June, Kristen Lord, a good friend, well known to this group and the current president of IREX, will be speaking in the first Monday. And also on the 13th of May, the PDAAA have its awards for practice in public diplomacy, and I would commend that meeting with some really terrific projects will be presented and acknowledged. We're already talking about what we're going to do in the summer. I've heard great ideas. I'm hoping there'll be something to do with Canada, and I look forward to being part of the conversation going forward. I've always enjoyed this group as a speaker, and it's great to have an opportunity to give back and be part of the ongoing life of this really exciting community of study and practice.
Thank you, Nick.
Thanks.
Jack,
I want to
ahead.
say thank you very much. First of all, I think from now on, Nick, I'm never going to accept another speaking engagement. I'm just going to have you talk. You do a better job of summarizing my book. And I appreciate your generosity coming from you. That means an enormous lot. Joan, Sherry, thank you very much for having me on. I appreciate it.
And thanks, Alex. Thanks, everybody. Great event. Appreciate it. Buy the book.